I'm going to, these are the main focus of my presentation today. I'll be giving you a very brief background of supervision practices over the years, and that sets, the scene for what follows. And what I will be doing in that section is also talk a little bit about the evidence we have seen so far in offender supervision practices. And then I will also talk very briefly about the mainstream psychology and how the positive psychology movement has come out of that, the mainstream psychology, and then the rationale for my research project, and what can we learn from the mainstream or the positive psychology movement that we can cross-fertilize in our offender supervision practices. Generally, there is an up and a down in in the supervision practices. We can generally categorize supervision practices into three major areas. The first one is the casework model. We're all familiar with that model, and that was in the 1950s and early 60s, and before that, beyond that. That was purely an area that a social work practice, probation officers used to do. And that era has never had just a systemic assessment of how supervision takes place. We never had how we structure, it's purely based on welfare practices. Probation officers usually used to follow offenders in different agencies and support them. The language of the era was about befriending and just helping them through. There was no really emphasis on risk, the idea of recidivism and how we can manage, and just purely on casework model, on welfare model. And what follows, the 1950s, 60s was, as we all know, the 1960s was an era where we had, where civil liberties movement, the gender inequality, racial inequality, and that area was really dominated by a lot of social movements. And so that era also coincided with the baby boomers coming out of age, and also the high unemployment rate. We all know that the 70s, early 70s, was characterized by stagflation, what economists would normally call it, and that is unprecedented economic downturn. Unemployment was up, inflation was up, and the consequence of that was a lot of street crimes. And then that street crime has actually caused a lot of fear, public fear about the crime. So we saw the first time politics is actually taking benefit out of crime policies. Richard Nixon in the United States, he was the champion of those eras in crime policies. He was the first person that to be re-elected based on getting tough on crime. And so what is coincided during that period of time also, a research by the guy called Robert Martinson. He conducted an assessment of the intervention programs or rehabilitation programs, he came up with a conclusion that rehabilitation actually doesn't work. So the main focus of supervision, because of this all politics and economical downturn, was just focusing on risk management. And that risk management, the idea of that risk management is one, prison rate was high. The rationale behind offender supervision was just to reduce overcrowding in the prison. And another reason for supervision was purely on cost reduction and public protection concept. So there wasn't really a rehabilitative focus on offender supervision practices in the 70s. Then what followed after that was some researchers actually concerned. The guy that Robert Martinson actually tried to correct what he did, because his methodology was very flawed. He wanted to rectify that, his conclusion that actually there are some offender supervision practices that can actually work. But it was too late, and for politicians, it was a very attractive proposition. So that makes them really attractive for being re-elected if they talk about getting tough. We heard this afternoon a speech. It's really very encouraging. You would not expect that kind of a speech from a minister in today's society, because the public perception is the tougher the politicians are on crime policies, and the more likely they will be elected again. So it was just a short-term policy focus, a short-term public protection agenda. That was the 1970s. But some researchers actually refuted that idea. Researchers from Canada and in the United States, they did this meta-analytic studies, and they came up actually rehabilitation actually works. And then that's when we moved into the risk needs and responsibility approach. You hear me at the back? So these are a number of researches have been conducted based on risk-based approach in the 1970s and in the early 80s. Most of these studies are randomized experiment studies, and that means comparing offenders that had received intensive supervision with offenders that received less intensive studies. And all those studies revealed actually the intensity of supervision does not actually reduce recidivism. In fact, in some cases, it actually increases recidivism. So those policies in the 70s, even research in that area, researchers tried to demonstrate that actually getting tough is not really the way to reduce recidivism. So a similar study compared that intensive supervision with traditional supervision practice. This is about bringing all researchers together and looking at what is the finding from each research. And when they did that, again, they came up with the same conclusion. And so that intensive supervision practice actually did not work. This is another study in the United States, also revealed the same outcome. And this is something that one of the speakers this morning talking about justice reinvestment. Research in that area, actually, investment in law and order area compared with investment in employment area. And that's actually a big difference. When we invest in law and order area, the outcome actually, a 10% increase in the size of police force results in 3%. And you compare the same amount of investment in employment area could actually result in a much more larger impact on reducing recidivism. A similar study is that looked at wages, income. When we increase household income through wages by 10%, up to 25% crime rate lower at national level. This is a US study, and 6% at the state level. And same thing in education. When you increase €1 education on average, actually can lower reduce the arrest rates. So this is the whole idea is that the justice reinvestment idea being talked about this morning is we can put the same amount of money or shift the money what is invested somewhere in the prison system and put it in the social system. We can actually come up with a better outcome. So what works best? You all know this is a much more familiar approach in correctional practice. So the risk needs responsibility principles actually is we need to spend our money in an area where we need to spend it, which means we need to use a validated assessment tool and use that our resources more onto high-risk offenders. And so that the law, if you visualize that the bell-shaped curve, so low-risk offenders and extremely high-risk offenders, the low-risk offenders already, functional people, without having extensive support from us, they can actually rehabilitate, or they got good network and pro-social friends. So we wouldn't need to spend much of the time with the low-risk offenders. So spending most of the time with the high-risk offenders actually can work. And the principle is, and then when we assess them and we identify those, what they call it normally the big 8, like pro-social, antisocial attitudes and drug and alcohol use. If we target those offense-related behaviors and use also a methodology that works individually, addresses, not all offenders are the same, so we need to tailor it. That's the responsibility principle. And if we can do that, we can actually reduce recidivism. So the idea is, previous studies shown that the strict compliance approach doesn't work. What could work is integrating rehabilitation with monitoring, which means we can't ignore risk. We can also address risk, but at the same time, we need to address the needs of those people in terms of intervention. Different offenders have different needs, so we need to focus on those rehabilitation needs. When we combine the two, that's actually what could make a difference. So the risk needs principle is actually modified so many times, and there was a lot of criticism about that approach from various researchers and scholars around. it did really focus on risk. It didn't address some of the other contextual factors. Because of those criticisms, that model has actually evolved and improved. So some of the things that can actually improve recidivism is the quality of relationship that isn't addressed within that model. The quality of relationship is a critical aspect of working relationship with offenders. The lesson we have, for example, from psychotherapy is they did about almost half a century study, and what they found is up to 30% of impact, up to 30% of change process comes from having a good relationship with therapist and the client. So the program impact is actually up to 15%. We may run CBT program or other programs, but the impact of those programs is up to 15%. What is more even important is a client's or an offender's network, social network. That kind of relationship, is they have a positive relationship within that network, that could even work more. Up to 40% of the change process is facilitated by external factors. So that the first point is quality of relationship with the people we work with is the most important aspect. So that's what research revealed. And another one is knowledge of workers. So without knowledge and skill, well-developed skill, our effort in terms of tackling recidivism actually can be a difficult process. And caseload size, again, another one. The more time supervising officers have with offenders, the more likely they to address a number of issues. And when we do supervision, we deal with several issues, and that issue is when workers have more time, they're more likely to engage them on a continuous basis. And so actually, case workload size matters. If someone supervising 100 offenders would have different time than someone who would be doing 50. So that's what the research has shown to be effective. And another one is perception, offenders' perception. It's another extension of that working relationship. If they perceive that their workers are helpful or going programs or drug and alcohol or any cognitive part of intervention programs, if they perceive that program would support them, would help them, that actually more likely to contribute to the risk of recidivism. Managers or supervisors' knowledge is another vital area. Managers who have that knowledge and understanding are more likely to support staff through the process. So that actually is linked with risk of recidivism. The more up-to-date we are with the new knowledge, the more likely we can actually contribute to the long-term public safety or reduction of recidivism. But if there is a belief or that something that did work 20 years ago, if still people think that still works, so that can be an obstacle in terms of moving. So these are some of the examples that have shown some outcome in the supervision area. The STICS program comes from Canada. These Canadian researchers developed that program, And a similar program is that the proactive community supervision in the US. And while they are based on risk, needs, and responsibility principles, they can actually integrate the various skills that are necessary in terms of working with offenders and building relationship and having that the foundational skill. So these are really preparatory. They prepare what they did in those pilot programs is they trained staff and they assigned clients and they structured the program in a way that follows the risk needs principles at the same time developing that healthy and trusting relationship with the offenders. And in the end, they assessed the outcome of that these pilot programs. And people actually, offenders supervised under these programs are less likely to reoffend than offenders who weren't supervised under that approach. So the only thing is this is very highly intensive programs, pilot programs. A lot of money is spent on them, and when they actually get introduced in the field, it doesn't necessarily mean the same level of commitment resources will follow. And so that's only if we can keep spending the same amount of resources, energy, we can actually make them work. So that's the only limitation of this kind of approach. So it doesn't mean they have the same level of intensity and commitment over a long period of time. So this is something that very similar approach in South Australia. So we have the enhanced community correction scheme, and very similar our structuring and classifying offenders according to risk levels. So the control, change, assist clients generally fall under medium to high risk categories. The monitor ones are the low risk groups. So we have a supervision practice that responds based on those risk classification. So if an offender is on a control tier, and generally would have about 8 hours contact with the supervising officers, and 4 hours for the change tier, 2 hours for the assist, and 1 hour for a monitor per month. So that reflects the level of intensity of supervision with the person. Then something in progress to create a sort of hybrid offender supervision practice, like similar to the STICs and the proactive community corrections. We had a project called evidence-based project that is designed to skill up staff so that they can work within that evidence-based practice. And that means when they meet with individual offenders, and they're not only focusing on risk and needs, and they're actually trying to provide some level of rehabilitative, to assume some rehabilitative element within the supervision component. Intervention is a very, one of the main areas of supervision in South Australia, but the way it works at the moment is different professional groups. Some groups are responsible for oversight managing offenders, while others are facilitating programs. But the idea with that, the evidence-based project, is if that same level of skill is learned by supervising officers, they could actually take some rehabilitation role within that supervision context. So what else can we do? So I think this is where my research is trying to link what else can we do. We've seen different, research so far has shown skilling supervising officers or helping supervisor officers establish good relationship. All those elements help reduce risk of recidivism. So it doesn't necessarily mean knowledge is something that is complete. We need to explore. We need to keep doing things and build on what we know. So that's where the thinking comes, for this project. So the mainstream psychology before World War II, it had some balance. It used to deal with strengths-based approach as well as problem-based approach. Psychology generally had a balance during those period of time. So the issue started to come up after the World War II, and that was veterans went World War I, and they returned with all sorts of issues, and post-traumatic stress disorder and mental health has increased. So that actually diverted the attention of researchers and practitioners away from a balanced profession to a single or one-sided approach. Much of the funding even started to flow to one direction. So that actually created a lot of concern and disagreement between professionals that are working in the field and academics doing research, and in favor of keeping up the balanced approach. So that's where the positive psychology movement was born, and trying to create that balance, restore the practices before, like the one before World War II, psychology had a balance. So why can't we do both the strengths approach and risk-based approach? The pioneer, while the concept of positive psychology is not new, Michael Seligman is very often associated with that movement. He was the president of the American Psychological Association in 1998, that during his first term address, he announced that his mission was to create that balance between those two fractured, two-side approach. So psychologists, positive psychologists, that's how they defined it, but it's before, humanistic psychology and, other approaches, people used to associate it with fuzzy concept that we can't measure. So if we can't measure something, must not be good. So they're trying to divert that belief. Actually, all positive psychology constructs are measurable. We can study them, we can describe them. So that's the main emphasis of the definition. And positive psychology does not mean that avoiding risk or avoiding problems. It actually deals with the problem and also looks at risks. At the same time, we need to recognize as well that strengths are also equally important. And in the context of our work, studying positive traits is about studying what protects offenders from. It's more of about prevention, or just intervening before it becomes really worse. And rehabilitation or intervention would be the last strategy. We need, the idea is, why can't we do something else before it gets, before we get into problems? Just a preventive approach, and then intervene early. So these are some of the examples of the research from since 1998, and we have had a lot of research coming into the field. Some of the evidence from that is, for example, like life satisfaction and happiness are linked with reduced mortality and better mental health and good relationship. And also, like self-efficacy, optimism are closely linked with job performance and staff turnover. And more study is also found that in sports area, people with positive traits or motivation and self-efficacy, they're more likely to perform better. So there is another research by Fredrickson. So actually practicing one positive for every negative thing that comes into people's mind, and if they come up with 3 positive things, practicing those simple concepts actually has shown to improve health in a number of areas. And flexibility again comes with positive thinking, positive patterns of thought. So our emotion is also very closely linked with our brain system, our immune system, our endocrine system. So the way our heart, lung, and physiology works actually closely linked with our emotion. So when we're happy, our brain responds differently. When we are happy or when we think something positive, our brain mechanisms actually secrete some healthy hormonal hormones within our body. So that actually linked. It's not really a fuzzy concept. It's really closely linked. The way we think is linked with the way our brain functions and our body responds. So these are again similar studies in those areas. Negative emotions actually generate harmful messages. They generate harmful messages. They secrete those harmful hormonal. They create those hormonal imbalances. So positive emotion, on the other hand, they can actually facilitate and activate those yes, you can see those. See? Again, see the same studies. A lot. What it says generally is the way we think. All those positive psychology constructs can actually lead into healthy living. I'll jump on this one, go quickly. So looking at that, now there are quite diverse areas of positive psychology constructs. I'm actually looking at the 4 major areas, and flexibility, efficacy, optimism, and hope. So the combining, this is a model I'm trying to test, and I'm collecting data on those 4 constructs and trying to analyze them, whether that the 4 factors combined can actually mediate the relationship between criminogenic risk factors and offender supervision outcomes, which means if offenders are low on those protective factors, we can actually increase those areas by creating some way of interacting with offenders in the normal supervision practice to improve the offender supervision outcome. Again, I'm running out of time, so I have to be quick. Flexibility is an area that has shown a lot of positive outcome in a range of health, sport, in various areas. So the idea is if we can integrate this concept within the offender supervision practices, we could actually come up with some improved practices. So self-efficacy, this is well-known, commonly used concept in our practice, but very, very little utilization of this skill. So if we combine this with other constructs, we can actually it is possible that we can develop a strategy, a protective psychological assessment process that can help the supervision process. Optimism is the other one. Then hope. So these are the 3 hypotheses I'm trying to test, and looking at individuals, factors, and then the 4 factors combined, and creating a tool that can be utilized in combination. And data collection is close to finish, and these are the measures that I'm using, and all those tools are validated tools used in a number of research areas, and gathering those data based on those assessment instruments. So the procedure again. So this is a anticipated contribution. Potential application. So it's very much, we got tools at the moment. I think by utilizing on positive psychology concepts, we can actually help that self-regulation mechanism and strengthen the motivational, interviewing techniques. Limitations. I'm running out of time, so that I'm just quitting. Any question?